backstory with how that all came about. And then we do have the new one coming out that's just out about a month now. It's a little black book, and this is a black book in terms of black diamond. It's a little bit more expert terrain in this book. And I co-authored this one as well with, but this one I wrote with Chris Hunt. And Chris was introduced to me by Charlie Myers. And the story goes that I was working for Field and Stream magazine. I was the fly fishing editor for Field and Stream. And Charlie, of course, with the Denver Post. And Charlie called me up one day. He said, Deeter, we got to go to the Wyoming range and we got to do a story. And I said, okay, well, let's go. And so we drove and we went to cover the Wyoming range to protect it from oil and gas drilling. And we did. We went to the Tri-Basin Divide. And the first person that we met there was this young guy named Chris Hunt. And Chris was organizing. He was the TU organizer of that specific trip. So Charlie and I went on to write the stories, but driving home from that particular outing was when we drove through the night to get back to Denver because Charlie had to be somewhere on a Monday morning. And we came up with the Little Red Book of Fly Fishing. And the idea was, let's just open our notebooks and offer some simple tips and all that. And so that's what happened. And the little book has done well. It sold over 120,000 copies for a fly fishing book. That's more than we ever thought it would. So anyway, it was nice to come full circle. And when I thought we'd do a sequel to the book, it seemed only natural that I would kind of connect that dot and end up doing the little black book with Chris Hunt. And Chris used to work at TU. He was our digital editor, and he worked for me on my staff. And now he's kind of off and just freelancing full time, but we remain really close friends and always have been. In fact, Chris Hunt was the one who hired me to come and take over the magazine at TU. So anyway, I'm going to try to share my screen, but I'll blow through this presentation real quick. It's I promised folks some essence of the tips and stuff and so forth and things that I've picked up around the world. I'm lucky. My job is that I've, for the last 20 years, I've gone all over the world and written stories about fishing. And, someone's got to do it. I'm taking one for the team. I appreciate, the sympathy, but it's been a great run. But also coming back and doing the Trout Unlimited stuff and doing this magazine is really, really important for a number of reasons. So when I'm done with the presentation, assuming it works, I'm happy to answer any questions that people have. We can channel them one way, or you can speak up and I'll hear you or whatever, but happy to talk about Trout Magazine and why we do what we do and where we're going in the future. I'm happy to talk about fly fishing industry. I'm also the editor of Angling Trade. So what we're seeing in terms of trends and what we see in terms of the future, what I think the conservation issues are. Happy to talk about products. I'm talking about tips, answer questions about favorite places to fish and whatever. So let's see if we can roll with this and we'll go from there. Okay. Am I sharing? Can you all see it? Not yet. It's not letting me do it, folks. I can work on it, but in the meantime, maybe we can hit some of those subjects that I brought up, and then we can circle back and I can show you pretty pictures of the fish. But if we want to ask some questions about Trout Magazine or Field and Stream or different places. When I've done these in the past, they kind of get rolling more the less I talk, just with the blank screen or showing the pictures of fish, and the more we get back into a dialogue. So does anyone have a question that they want to hit me with?
Yeah, I have one.
Please.
Come on up, Buzz. Buzz, I'm going to hand you the mic.
Hi, Kirk. My name is Buzz Sword. One of your previous presentations, I believe it was the very last one you gave to our chapter. In the category of flight time, you mentioned how important it was to have eyes tied into the fly.
Yeah.
I remember the comment, but I don't recall why and wherefore. So could you expand a little bit on that for us?
Sure.
That?
That's awesome. Thanks for remembering. So this stems back to a trip that I took to Bolivia about 15 years ago. You might all see in the magazines and what there's lodges and they catch Dorado in Bolivia. I was on part of the trip where they were exploring that. And I was down in Tierra del Fuego fishing for brown trout, and Marcelo Perez said, Kirk, if you really thought this was fun and adventure in South America, let me show you what Bolivia is all about. So we went, and I was 3 weeks in the jungle. We slept in tents in the jungle. We flew in on a little plane and we paddled around. So this is all before the lodges ever got built. But one of the things that they showed me, and one of my favorite parts of all of fishing is taking tips now that I'm able to branch out and go different parts of the world, is taking tips that I learned somewhere else and then bringing them back here. And one of the things that they always do when they're fishing for Dorado in the jungle is they fish barbell eyes because the currents are moving fast. But the Dorado likes to attack the head of the bait that they're attacking. So if the barbell eyes, if I throw a fly and it gets bit and the barbells get scratched off and the eyes are gone or whatever, they'll immediately switch the fly. So I thought, wow, that's interesting. I've always used just like a little black woolly bugger or whatever. So I started coming back to Colorado and I started putting eyes on every fly pattern, streamer fly pattern that I've been fishing with. Like even if I were to fish a zonker or just a black woolly bugger or something like that, putting small eyes on the flies. I think a part of it is twofold, right? It's all about weight, and so much about fly fishing is about weight in general. Nymph fishing, like my friend Pat Dorsey says, the difference between a good angler and a great angler is often a BB, right? So same thing with streamers and controlling the speed and depth of the streamer presentation. But I also think that those eyes show some kind of life, and I think that that's an important mix. And so if you looked at my streamer box today, I'd say over half of the flies have eyes on them. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet. That was a good one. I like that kind of stuff. So if anyone else, keep on rolling. I'm liking this.
Kirk, while somebody comes up with a question here, can we have a go at your share screen?
Yeah, I've tried, and it's sending me back to I've got a grant.
So you've got a share screen button, is that correct?
Yeah, and it says open system preferences to open my system. And
so it shouldn't be system preferences. There should be literally a button that says share screen.
Yep. I push it on the bottom and it sends me to my own system preferences.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's like one step removed. So I'll still, believe it or not, as I've been talking, I've still kind of been working my way through that too. But,
Other questions?
What's the significance of the Michigan hat?
I'm from Michigan. Well, I went to school at Michigan in Ann Arbor. I grew up a lot of places. Was born in Ohio, and I grew up in Wisconsin mostly for most of my high school years. Finished high school in Eastern Pennsylvania, and I went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and met my wife there. And true story is that I took up fly fishing while I was at school there because I wanted to impress her dad. I was a bait fisherman and a gear chucker. My dad worked for Johnson Outdoors in Wisconsin, and I would throw spoons off the piers and catch salmon and stuff like that. And I was always a fishy little guy growing up, but never fly fished much until I met this girl, and she told me about her dad and the cabin. I got invited to visit them at the cabin some summer, and didn't know why in the world anyone would ever have a cabin on a river. Didn't make any sense to me at all. And I went up there, and they sent me off to fish as soon as I got there, and everyone thought I was lost. But when they found me, the first thing I said was, "Do I have to come back?" And that was when her dad knew that I was the one. And she and I have been married for 33 years now, so it's worked out. But that was my story. And we still have the family cabin in Michigan. It's on the Baldwin River, and the Baldwin is where the first brown trout were introduced in the United States in 1884. So some of you might have heard through the interwebs that I've been criticized for my fondness for brown trout, and not over native trout. Don't get me wrong. I'm all for natives first, wild fish second, and everything else after that. But I do have a fondness for brown trout that dates back to where I learned to fish. And ironically, it's that one species that's really led me to most places in the world that I've been to. It's, chasing brown trout in Iceland and New Zealand and Australia and other places. And that's actually the book that I'm working on now while I'm on my sabbatical.
Other questions? We got a couple on the chat if we want to.
Yeah.
So first one is what is happening with the COVID-based boost in fly fishing over the long term?
Yeah. So there's a couple things. That's a really good conversation starter. That we've seen the boom, and there's been a little bit of pullback on that. If you talk to the Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation, I think the numbers are down this year 1 or 2% compared to last. You wouldn't know that by looking at some of our rivers and how crowded they are. And that in and of itself has been an issue that I think that it's prompted a lot within the industry to talk about things like limiting your catch as opposed to going out and trying to catch 50 fish every time you go out, because we're sharing the resource. And we're seeing some more pressure directly impact fish populations in rivers like the Big Hole in Montana and the Madison and elsewhere. So it used to be that you'd run out the door and try to catch as many fish as you possibly. I mean, that's what fishing is, right? It has been for many of us. My mom doesn't fish, but I call her and I say, "Hey, I went fishing, Mom," and she says, "How many did you catch?" That's the first thing she asks me, and I think that we're starting to think a little bit more broadly about sustainability and sustaining the industry and spreading things out and so on and so forth. So there's also been a real positive side to all that too, however, and that is that we see a lot more families. We see a lot more diverse demographic. There's a huge thirst for knowledge now. A lot of young families and a lot of younger people during the pandemic went out and found water because it was one of the things they could do when there's no movie theaters, there's no bowling alleys, there's no T-ball leagues for kids and stuff like that. And 95% of those people who found water during the pandemic have indicated through surveys and otherwise that they want to stay connected to the water. That's great. That's good because it increases the base of people who can be stewards for the resources and all the things that you all and all of us care about, and that's why we're involved with Trout Unlimited. So we're starting to see within TU National a little bit more uptick in that regard. We're changing our engagement model a little bit. You'll hear more about this from Chris Wood and others, but you know, a lot of the younger demographic are they're just not joiners. They don't pay their $35 and join something, but they certainly spend time fixing rivers and doing volunteer work and so on and so forth. So we're endeavoring to count them in the fold as we go, and also to communicate a lot more with them. And that's why you see more and more magazine covers like this and the things that we've done lately with Trout Magazine, like what are you really fishing for, which was a story about why we fish more than how we fish. So I'm encouraged. I think it's a time of opportunity. I think it's a time of challenge to communicate more and to get shops and outfitters to get on board with, not trying to make as much money as they can, as fast as they can, which is counterintuitive, but we need to look for the long range and how we sustain the sport. And I think that's why we're also doing things like what are you really fishing for? There's a lot more that we benefit from as we share these resources than just feeling the tug of a fish and the adrenaline. So I'm reading off the comment thread here. How about some key tips on fall streamer fishing? I'll just go right down the list. And fall streamer fishing, I mean, obviously now is the time. A lot of fish are on the move, getting ready, staging to spawn, and they're, I don't really like to fish for fish when they are spawning, but as they're moving and staking out their territory, they get very aggressive on streamers. The only thing I would say is a best tip going forward is now is really, really an important time to make the streamer act naturally. Like the streamer should appear in the vision of the fish and escape. And sometimes you can dead drift streamers. Sure, they look like a leech floating down the stream or whatnot, but I really think in the fall, it's about action. And the other really important streamer tip this time of year is if you're covering water, you want to step and move as you go. If you make baby steps as you're moving, say you're going top down in the river, and you take tiny little baby steps, all you're doing is broadcasting to the fish along the bank. And 90% of the fish that'll eat a streamer are hugging the bank. You can cast into the bank and swing it off. You're broadcasting to them if they see that thing coming down river at them. You want to take one good cast and move at least 2 or 3 feet before you make your next cast. It's more important now than ever, and trust me, that's something that you want to key on. So I'm going to read one more, and then if someone's got just jump in with questions. But what is happening to the fly fishing business as we struggle through a recession of some form? I think it's too early to tell. I will say from the angling trade perspective and following what products people are making, there's more and more emphasis on the mid-price stuff. Last year, you saw 3 different fly rods come out at the International Fly Tackle Dealer Show where the retail price eclipsed $1,000. And I thought, geez, man, you can get a set of golf clubs or something like that for the price of one rod. I don't know how sustainable that is. But now Scott's come out with a $600 rod, and Hardy has come out with a $400 rod. I know something's in the work with Orvis. I know some others. So I think that you're going to start to see the natural progression of people not going for super premium, but more utilitarian type products. And those are going to be most of the new products that you see offered in the next 3 to 6 months. And then, heck, I think, most of the shops that I have talked to have had the best year this year that they've had in a long time. Last year during the boom, there were a lot of people on the rivers, but the supply chain was so screwed up that they couldn't get product. And you many of you know, you couldn't get a pair of waders if you wanted to, or you couldn't buy a rod, or like you'd hear about it. And it was a frustration for me as an editor. We would write something and then no one could get it. My Little Black Book sat off the coast of Long Beach, California in a shipping container for, literally 6 months before. So it was supposed to come out in February and then May and June. So everything was so goofy in 2020, 2021 that, the people were there and there was demand, but there was no product. You couldn't buy a boat. I mean, you couldn't get a raft if you wanted one. And still it's tough now, but the supply chain issues are easing and the manufacturers are coming around. And so many of the bottom line performance of shops and manufacturers in the last 8 months has been record. And I think we'll still be pretty good going forward, even in a light recession.
Give a high-level overview of what you cover in the Little Black Book.
Kirk,
Sure.
can you give a high-level overview of what you're covering in the Little Black Book?
Yeah, bet. Yeah, yep. So what we did with the Little Red Book is we broke fly fishing down into easily digestible chunks. Like what matters when you fly fish? It's okay, casting. A lot of people want to know about casting. Then, what happens when your fly hits, picking the fly? What fly should I tie on and why? So bugs, that's a section. Casting is a section. Reading the water. Where do I put my fly? Where do I think it's going to go? Where do I think that the fish are going to be? What if I can't see them, but I anticipate where they're going to be? So reading water, that's another section. And then presentation, what happens when your fly hits the water, which I personally think is the most important of all. A lot of subtle differences, but that's where we really separate, great fishing from average fishing, I think. And then we had a catch-all miscellaneous, and we did the same exact pattern, same exact cut size, same exact template in the Little Black Book of Fly Fishing. And we follow the cast, and we talk about flies, we talk about reading water and the fish, and we talk about presentation, but we also have a much bigger miscellaneous catch-all section, which is kind of, things that would fall into that would be like how you fight a fish, how you land a fish faster, how you, fish fiberglass versus, a graphite rod, that kind of stuff. We also talk more in different species. I'd say 99% of the Red Book was trout. And because if you look at the industry, 75% of all the fly rods sold in the country right now are 9-foot 5 weights. It's a trout centric world. That's why, when I'm all for carp fishing. I've written books on that. I've done, bass, and I love saltwater fishing. I love all of it. But at the end of the day, if you were to ask manufacturers, what percentage of their product SKUs are trout centric, it's over 70%, which is why Trout Unlimited is so important to the fly fishing industry, because where they're not anglers like us in Colorado or in Connecticut or in Pennsylvania, we kind of feed the beast and become the anglers who go to the flats and blue water and all those other things as well. So in the Little Black Book, we talk a lot more about specific things like carp fishing and, saltwater stuff, bass stuff. And the other thing that makes this a little bit different, most of these tips in this book are from our experience, Charlie and my experiences in the United States. And there's more international in this. Like I was talking about the Bolivia trick with the eyes, but lots from New Zealand and Australia and things that they do where they have super finicky trout. And I've learned that bringing those tips back to here has really upped my game. I'll give you an example of one casting tip from New Zealand. And that is that when you see a fish, say you're sight fishing to a trout and it's up and it's feeding, and you're in clear water and the fish is holding the edge of a current. In New Zealand, they would say, imagine that fish is right behind a car. He's right behind the license plate of the car. And what you want to do is not cast at the license plate, because even your monofilament or fluorocarbon leader is enough, they think, to spook the trout down in New Zealand. They would much rather have you aim at the tail light, which is just a foot or two off to the side, still in clear water where a trout can see that bug as it floats by. So, and then it'll make it move. And if it doesn't make a move, but you know that you've made an accurate cast, they switch flies right on that one cast. We don't make the same. They kind of tease us Americans for trying to beat the fish into submission, right? It's not, I'm going to throw them away. Size 16 parachute Adams are going to eat it now. Well, they didn't eat it that time, but for sure they're going to eat it this time. Well, for sure they're going to eat it this time. And the odds go down every time, as you know. So little stuff like that. That's kind of where we went with the little black book of fly fishing.
Kirk, if you were to get the little black book, is that sort of replace the little red book, or would they both be useful guides?
Well, I think they're both good for, I think there are some tips that are repeated, kind of revisited. I wouldn't say exactly repeated, but some tips that I like so much from the red book that I felt like saying we should talk about them again. One of my favorite casting tips of all from the red book that's also in the black book is that you want to keep your thumb in your peripheral vision as you cast. Okay. Doing so, you don't want to stare at your thumb as you're casting. And you don't want to, focus, you want to look forward. But if you're not seeing it out of the corner of your eye, literally, two things are going wrong. One, you're either going too far back, which is the most common mistake of most novice casters, or you're cocking your wrist too far back and you lose your thumb that way. Those are the two casting mistakes that you can fix with one simple trick, like keeping your thumb in your peripheral vision.
We've got a question here. Lauren, can you come?
Hey, Kirk, it's Lauren.
Hey.
For you, wanted to know your thoughts on the future of fly fishing given climate change and the associated impacts that we see on our rivers, specifically wildfire, increasing temperatures, and some loss of that riparian zone.
Yeah, there was an interesting study Tim Klein did, and it was reported not long, like a couple of weeks ago. I forgot where. It was New York Times, I think. Elsewhere, but like just the numbers are that Montana would lose 20% of it or more of its fishing economy within the next 40 years, which to me is kind of, because of loss of habitat, right? So to me, that writing has been on the wall so clearly for so long. It wasn't like an earth-shaking report at all to me. I thought Captain Obvious, but I do think that people are starting to wake up to some of the things that I was talking about earlier. So if rivers are warmer, we got to be careful. Hoot owl restrictions, for example, arbitrary time of day. It seems to me that we can get a lot more sophisticated by how we go about those types of things. I mean, if you're gonna go out in the morning and catch 20 fish with a weighted nymph rig just to rack up numbers, but you call it quits at 1:30 in the afternoon, are you really having less impact on the resource? And my answer is no, you're not. So I think we need to get a lot more smart about how we approach fishing. So that's one thing. And two, I think that diversifying the species, I mean, if we like the act of fly fishing, I love when people talk to me about how they were smallmouth bass fishing or they went pike fishing. And yeah, some of those critters are critters that compete with trout, and we don't want them necessarily doing that. But, in the what is scenario where they are, for example, I have a lake nearby here that I go and it's filled with pike. And, when the Yampa River gets hot, and I don't trout fish, I don't fish here in July and August anymore. And when I do, I go to the lake, and when I fish in the lake, I fish for pike. And that's just the way it's gone. And I think that that's going to continue. Lastly, I think seasons will change. I think that the fly fishing season in my area now really just started again. It's like a reboot. 1st of September is kind of when the season starts, oftentimes, I think. So, and it starts in March, and then it goes until the runoff, and then a little bit after the runoff, and then things get hot, and we shut down for a month and a half. I think that's the new normal. And when I have friends from Philadelphia or Michigan who want to do their highly anticipated once a year visit to Colorado or Montana, I tell them to come in the end of September or early October now. So I hope that answers your question. You can tell I can get rolling on some of these answers. It's a dangerous thing.
There's a question that came through on the chat about
Yeah.
diversity. How do we get more diverse members into Trouts Unlimited?
Yeah, so I think, I'll share my editorial philosophy, right? And my editorial philosophy is not to talk the talk, rather to walk the walk. In other words, talk about more people of color or more women involved and so forth. Instead of doing a women's issue, our philosophy is to have more women involved in the actual making of the magazine than any other magazine. So a higher percentage of our photographers and writers and our editor staff, design staff, that kind of really, really strongly represented there. And I've been very consciously as editor looking for talent, not trying to force the issue, but when I see an interesting perspective, like a couple years ago, we had a nice young artist, Alana Lyons, who is a first-generation Pacific Islander immigrant, design a special cover for Trout Magazine, and then also chronicle her experiences of going through the West and catching native species. And it was such a good package that, like, of course, you're going to move that up in terms of prominence. So I think involving more voices in the actual storytelling is the key to getting more eyes on your work and the key to getting more eyes on our organization as a whole. And, being inclusive by action. It's also very important to understand the different cultures and the different expectations. One of the things that's hugely important for Trout Unlimited right now is working with various Native communities, Native American communities throughout the United States. And Bristol Bay would not have happened the way it happened were it not for the Native community there. We did a magazine package on Cuesta, New Mexico not long ago, and highlighted the community there and how that was, it's different than what we're used to driving from Denver to go and fish in New Mexico. But that was important. If we're going to take out there is no way we are going to take out the lower 4 Snake River dams and restore that steelhead fishery without the help of the Native communities in the Pacific Northwest and the full support there. So involving their goals and their aspirations and hearing their stories. One of the things with Bristol Bay, and I was involved with that like for years, before I ever joined Trout Unlimited, I was covering it for Field and Stream. And I went and I taught at the Bristol Bay Academy with the young UPIC community kids, really, who would come, and they were flown into one village of Equock and taught the skills of fishing. But we, rather than just one-way teaching, spent a lot of time listening, and like things like catch and release. And they weren't comfortable with, our values on catch and release. To them, it was like, playing with your food, right? It was dishonoring nature. So we talked through these things, and having an open mind and an open dialogue, I think, makes for more robust storytelling in the end, and better magazines, and better media in general. So I think, boiling that down, that's my editorial philosophy. I don't run a chapter, but I run a magazine. And that's what I'm pretty sure that's the way to go. And we've seen good results that way. And I would say emulating that on the chapter level is an important thing to do.
Okay. We've got another question here. Peter?
What are your thoughts on getting younger people involved in our chapter?
Younger people involved? I didn't quite hear. Did you say younger?
Yeah, he was saying how do we get younger people involved, and specifically with a chuckle under 50?
Yeah, young ones. Well, it's interesting. Well, I'd say a couple things. Looking at it from the industry perspective, there are a lot of younger people involved. It's a matter of getting them connected to our organization, whether they're members that show up at your chapter meeting or read my magazine or what. That's a bridge we'll cross. But if when I go to the river now, or if I go to the community pond, who I see there is not old, and not necessarily male. I see a lot of young families and it's mom who's tying on the fly. I see a lot in a destination town like Steamboat, where I live. Most of our traffic is 40 to 55-year-old, a lot of them from Texas and elsewhere, but they come in and they have a passion for fishing. And, so I think a lot of that, it's there. I think that was one of the messages that we just did with the daughters issue of Trout Magazine, where we're saying, so much of the discussion has always been about fathers and sons and grandfathers and so on and so forth. And we should talk more about women in the sport. Well, in my case, in my family, it's the women in the sport who've kind of carried the narrative as far as fly fishing is concerned. And I think that the women have been there all along for many of our families. And since this issue came out, we've heard more and more of that. So my philosophy is that there's a lot more there. And then lastly, however, what do we know the young aspiring, when you were younger and you wanted to learn how to fly fish, or you were starting out to fly fish, what did you want? Knowledge, right? Mentoring, someone teach me how to do this crazy sport. How can I figure this out? And we older anglers, and I'm loosely putting myself in that group because I don't feel that old, but I think we have a lot to offer. And I've never, quote unquote, been uncool or, when I talk to the young guys, when I talk to the guys at Fly Lords, for example, they love the tips that I can give them. They love the stories that I can give them from far corners of the world, that they're just hungry enough to start reaching out and seeing, for themselves, and encourage that and encourage everything and be positive along the way, and lay off the, oh, I remember when, or you should have seen it when, because no one cares about that. I think that that's the key for younger. And that's also a theme that you see a lot in Trout Magazine as we go forward.
Other questions? Buzz, you have one.
Yeah. Kurt, what advice would you have to give to a possible would-be contributor to your publications regarding written contributions, but more in particular to random stock photography?
Okay, I'm gonna hit both. And thank you for asking that question. It's it's great for me to be able to be clear as editor. So first of all, everyone might have a story to tell that they want to convey. But you got to understand that as editor, I have an agenda too. So I actually have the themes charted out for the next 2 years of magazines. They might change, they might be amended, but we're going to talk about like natives will be a theme coming up. Young storytellers giving their first published break to people who want to write a story but have. So if you ask us what we're up to and then tailor what you want to write about to be congruous with the track that we're on, the odds of making a match there go up exponentially versus someone sending me a 5,000 word manuscript. My biggest frustration, I'll just tell you, send me a 5,000 word manuscript about themselves fishing and how much they enjoyed it. And, at the end close by saying, and I've been a life member for 20 years and great. I appreciate that. But first of all, I'll never run 5,000 words in the magazine. I'm going to run, 800 to 1,200 words. And we're very specific on page, count and layouts and all those things. So working with us that way and understanding that aspect is really important. And understanding what we're going with themes and how we can connect to that, that's important. And on the photo side of things, all you really have to do is send maybe a little work sample, like a disc or just a flash drive to our art director, Jim Gray. And how our photos work is we'll do a call. We have a cadre of photographers that we work with, and it's an expanding pool. I like as many eyes as possible, many different perspectives as possible. But say we're doing a story and we want to do a story about the Orphan Boy mine, and we'll put a call out that says, does someone have, probably our staff would give us the mine shots, but maybe there's a cutthroat trout species that native to that drainage. And we'll put a call out to the photographers. We need an underwater shot of a cutthroat trout, or we need an underwater shot of a brook trout, or we need a shot of someone hiking in to remote wilderness or on horseback. And then people will submit the shots and then we pay by usage. So if we grab your shot and we use it for the cover, we pay you $600, stuff like that. Does that all make sense? Did I answer the question?
Thank you very much. And one other question.
Sure.
I visit Steamboat quite a bit, and I'm just curious. I'm not meaning to pry here, but you mentioned fishing a lake for trout. Is that other than perhaps stagecoach? What other possibilities are there?
Well, I'm talking about stagecoach pretty much, but for the trout, I like to go up high, and I like to go to Summit Lake and Jonah Lake, Martha Lake. You can ride the trail. It's a 4x4 trail to the top. It's about 3 miles back off of Buffalo Pass. And then it's Summit Lake is right there. You can walk from the parking lot right down and fish. And every other lake has different types of fish. Summit Lake has brook trout in it, and Jonah Lake has cutthroat trout in it. And I think Martha has cutthroat. And then I forgot the last one off the top of my head. I'm on the spot, but that's back to, I think they had brook trout in that one. So
Pike.
the pike are not up high, thankfully, Piker and Stagecoach for sure. That's where the state record pike. If you want to go look for big pike in spring ice out, that's like the place to go, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a question I'm reading off the thread. Would any of the photographers on the Trout Magazine staff be willing to talk to our chapter on the right and wrong way to take pics of fish and fish handling? Well, Tim Romano is my partner in angling trade and has been for 15 years. I'm sure Romano would talk to you. He's also our ad sales person and a regular contributor to Trout Magazine. But we're also initiating a content collaborative partnership with Keep Fish Wet, and Andy and Sasha Danilchuk are friends of mine. And I think as a service, we're going to have a standing column in the magazine about fish handling. And it's not just keeping them wet. You know, there are some things like how long you fight a fish, right? The size of your tippet. I'm not a big fan of record chasing because, you know, you play a fish for 2 hours on 7X tippet because you want to get your name in the record books. You're probably going to kill the fish anyway. So we need to, we're looking at lots of different ways, but yeah, I think, and that goes to the other point that I've made 2 or 3 times already, but like how we, let me just say it this way. How we fish, anglers themselves are as much a conservation concern these days as climate change, floods, those types of things. You know, how we treat the resources has as much lasting impact when it comes to how many fish are in the rivers anymore as these events that happen. And we need to acknowledge that and act responsibly. And I think that that's something you're going to see more and more of.
All right, any other questions? Anybody from online, don't hesitate to type something in the chat or just unmute and ask. Anybody else in the room?
You can tell I don't have any opinions and I don't, I'm not candid about what I say or anything.
We've got one more question here.
I think
Please.
after the fires, the wildfires up of Big Thompson and the Pooter, you might have had some opinions about how the fish would react. I wonder if you've got a comment about that now. Since it's been about a year or two since some of those fires.
Yeah, we've seen, so we had I'll talk about the fire down on the East Troublesome fire down on the Colorado, up headwaters of the Colorado that burned up and over the Continental Divide. But that's the one that I'm most familiar with and I can comment on with what we saw from the fishing this year. So this year, we were blessed to have rain, lots of rain. We were cursed that a lot of the days, the Colorado was pretty darn blown out because of the ash and silt and all the stuff that's gotten into the river. So those things take time, and it's going to take a lot of time to naturally push and flush those things. We just got to keep hoping for more and more rain and more snow. But I don't think, you know, how many, you guys all know, you've been, I mean, I've lived in Colorado for 25 years and before I moved up to Steamboat a few years ago, I lived down in Pine. So I used to fish a lot in Deckers and Cheeseman, and, you know, the Hayman fire was in 2002, I think. And I think we're still feeling the effects of the Hayman fire. You know, these things don't just happen and go away. I mean, these are concerns that are going to impact fishing. To the earlier question, they're going to impact fishing for our entire lifetime.
All right. I see one more thing here in the chat, so let's see what that is.
Yeah. Completely burned out. Fishery is still solid with many brookies. Well,
So-
good. I hope that continues, and brook trout tend to be pretty resilient in those. And I think that might be an altitude thing too. I mean, the effects are compounded the further we flush downstream, but like, we did a whole issue dedicated to fire last summer. And I encourage you to go back and look through it. Dr. Ashley Rust was the featured, story in that. And the long and short of it is nature's pretty resilient. These things can heal themselves, but they take time. And given the option, let's not have it happen in the first place. Right? That's really what we're talking about.
I think that's the end of the questions, and we're kind of getting to a time limit as well.
Well,
Thank you.
I would just like to say, I'm sorry I couldn't show you pretty pictures. I'll come down and visit with you in person and do the slideshow some other time when they want me. And I really appreciate your chapter and all you do. And we pay attention, and we know that you make a big impact. And anything I can ever do to help, I'm here to help you all. And I appreciate your support.
We appreciate all that you do as well, and we really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us tonight.
Great.
All right.
Thanks again, Kurt. Okay, our last business is the raffle.
Okay, my three numbers, 4, 2, 7.
427. Well, that's me.
Oh,